The wind whipping across the Kodinka aerodrome in Moscow that autumn of 1946 was a bitter, prophetic gale, carrying the dust of a demolished enemy and the seeds of a new, equally brutal confrontation. It was a wind that tasted of desperation, of an industrial empire strained to the absolute breaking point by the most catastrophic war in human history, yet simultaneously driven by the relentless, all-consuming ambition of a singular ideology. In the West, specifically across the English Channel and the vast American continent, the technical supremacy won on the battlefields had already transitioned into a seemingly placid yet strategically vital post-war research effort, a smooth, uninterrupted progression toward the next echelon of aerial power. Their engineers spoke of thrust-to-weight ratios and axial flow compressors with the casual confidence of men discussing the weather, working in pristine laboratories fueled by unlimited resources and a deep well of specialized knowledge earned through painstaking generational effort. But in the Soviet Union, there was no smooth transition, only a chasm, a technological gulf so wide that merely gazing into it invited vertigo and worse, a return ticket to the Siberian timber camps. This was the fundamental, non-negotiable problem facing the Politburo and the Soviet Air Force. The mathematics of war had changed, and they were staring down a decade-long deficit in a technology that would define the coming Cold War. The ultimate weapon, they understood, would not be the atomic bomb alone, but the industrial capacity to deliver it, to defend against it, and to overwhelm the enemy with sheer, devastating numbers. The jet engine, a screaming vortex of compressed air and fire, was the physical manifestation of that capacity, and they did not possess a reliable one. Among the ranks of those tasked with this impossible existential challenge was Comrade Valentin Petrovich Glushko, a chief designer whose very career was a testament to the ruthless, unforgiving nature of the Soviet machine. Glushko knew the consequences of failure not from textbooks, but from the frigid, bone-aching reality of the Gulag, a scar that drove his pursuit of power and speed with the zeal of a man running from his own shadow. He was a scientist, yes, but first and foremost, he was a survivor, a functionary of the state whose every calculation had to meet the terrifying dual metric of engineering performance and political expectation. Yet even his genius was mocked by the primitive technology at his disposal. Consider the contemporary Soviet attempts. The RD-10 engine, a tortured adaptation of the captured rudimentary German Jumo Not 04, delivered a pathetic 1,985 pounds of thrust and possessed a lifespan that could be measured in mere dozens of hours, often violently tearing itself apart before the first maintenance check. Then there was the indigenous TR-1, designed by the team of Lyulka, a slightly more powerful attempt that nonetheless remained unreliable, temperamental, and woefully underpowered for any truly tactical superiority. These were not instruments of global power projection. They were little more than flying furnaces, temperamental laboratory curiosities that lacked the precision-engineered soul of their Western counterparts. The test pilots strapping themselves into the early Yak-15 and MiG-9 were not engaging in advanced flight research. They were strapping themselves to an unpredictable, glorified cannon on wheels, risking a death by metal fatigue and spontaneous combustion every time the throttle was advanced. The grim juxtaposition was a constant, haunting presence. While the Soviet engineers sweated over rudimentary metallurgy, striving to create a turbine blade that would not melt under the centrifugal strain of 2,000 revolutions per minute, the engineers at Rolls-Royce and General Electric were already discussing bypass turbofans and pushing their engines toward 4,000 and 5,000 pounds of thrust with a quiet, almost arrogant efficiency. The Soviet technical deficit was not linear. It was exponential, compounding every month that passed. The material science alone, the sophisticated nickel-chromium alloys, the precision casting techniques, the understanding of sustained high-temperature physics, represented a wealth of industrial knowledge that the Soviet Union could not duplicate in years, perhaps not even a decade, no matter how many 5-year plans were decreed. The Central Committee recognized the horrifying truth. To wait for organic indigenous development was to willfully surrender the skies to the inevitable American bomber fleet. The Soviet Union was rich in land, steel, and human labor, but desperately poor in the specialized genius required for this hypermodern warfare. Therefore, in the insulated chambers of the Kremlin, a decision of profound and terrifying consequence was ratified. The desperation is so acute, the technical deficit so vast, that the state would forsake the slow path of independent engineering. They would instead engage their former allies in an unparalleled, high-stakes game of industrial subversion, disguising an act of corporate espionage as legitimate commerce. They would turn to the unsuspecting West, to the very people who held the secret of reliable power, and ask for it, not with guns, but with gold. The stage was thus irrevocably set for a diplomatic maneuver that would trade a handful of engines for global parity, changing the skies of the world forever. The English summer of 1946 was a season of weary triumph, a deceptive lull in the relentless march of technological warfare. Britain, though victorious, was exhausted, its factories scarred by the relentless pressure of 6 years of total war, its treasury drained, yet its inventive genius remained, momentarily, unchallengeable. This genius had coalesced in the mind of Sir Frank Whittle, but its execution lay in the sprawling industrial might of Rolls-Royce, a name synonymous not just with luxury automobiles, but with the high-stakes, uncompromising metallurgy of aerial power. Their crowning achievement, a compact masterpiece of compressed fury, was the Nene turbojet engine. This was no mere incremental improvement on captured German designs. It was a pure revelation of engineering physics, a clean-sheet design that employed a centrifugal flow compressor of unparalleled efficiency, a design that achieved a stunning 4,000 pounds of static thrust, power previously relegated to the heaviest propeller-driven bombers. The Nene was a technical artifact of such sophistication that it rendered all contemporary Soviet attempts, the stuttering, short-lived furnaces of the RD-10, obsolete before they even left the drawing board. It was a perfect, contained vortex of power and reliability, an engine that could run for hundreds of hours without self-destructing, a secret weapon in plain sight. The central, tragic irony of this moment, however, was not in the technical achievement, but in the political folly that immediately followed. In the corridors of power, an air of post-war, fraternal goodwill, and a desperate need for non-dollar foreign exchange seduced the Labor government into an act of profound and fatal naiveté. The premise was ludicrously simple: to sell this technological crown jewel, along with its smaller, equally advanced cousin, the Derwent V, to the Soviet Union. The rationale was based on a fundamental misreading of the ideological enemy and a dangerously inflated sense of industrial security. Key figures, most notably Sir Stafford Cripps, the then president of the Board of Trade, were convinced by the Soviet delegation's assurance that the engines were merely for non-strategic civilian transport, and, crucially, that the Soviets simply lacked the industrial precision and material science to ever reverse engineer the complex components. They saw gold and trade parity. They failed to see the mathematics of destruction that their gesture would unleash. This decision was not made without a chorus of terrified, yet ultimately unheeded, dissent. Within the halls of the Air Ministry and the nascent intelligence services, a small cadre of prescient officers understood the inherent existential threat. They argued with cold, hard logic. The technological lead represented years of research, millions of pounds of investment, and the unique specialized knowledge embedded within the nickel-chromium alloys of the turbine blades and the intricate casting of the compressor impellers. This knowledge was the strategic asset, not the airframe. "You are not selling them an engine," one exasperated military attaché reportedly declared. You are selling them the entire future of jet propulsion. They will not need to copy the engine, they only need to copy the idea of how to make it run reliably. Their warnings were dismissed as Cold War paranoia, a failure to embrace the new era of socialist cooperation. The internal divisions were stark. The pragmatists saw only immediate trade. The security-minded saw irreversible strategic surrender. The technical deep dive reveals the magnitude of the gift. The Nene's high compression ratio was a result of specialized light alloy forging in the compressor section, demanding temperatures and pressures the Soviets could only dream of. The turbine blades, the heart of the engine, were made of alloys with such high temperature resistance that they represented a closely guarded national secret, the difference between flight measured in minutes and flight measured in years. Rolls-Royce provided not only the 25 Nene engines and the 30 Derwent 5 engines, but the complete, comprehensive blueprint sets and material specifications detailing every dimension down to the thousandth of an inch. The logistical effort was immense, involving the painstaking crating of these high-tolerance machines for shipment across Europe, a monumental undertaking that stood in stark contrast to the small, petty price the British asked in return. And thus the scene was set for the fatal indulgence. In the late summer sun, great wooden crates, stenciled with the proud Rolls-Royce logo and destined for the Soviet Union, were carefully loaded onto ships in a British port. Each crate contained an engine, a compact 4,000-pound declaration of technological dominance, a weapon system disguised as a piece of industrial machinery. The irony of abundance had never been so clearly demonstrated. Britain, possessing the pinnacle of aerial technology, sold it for a few short-term pounds, convinced of its own unassailable industrial superiority, believing the Soviets could never truly duplicate the required precision. As the cargo holds closed over the crated jets, the seemingly trivial detail of their departure marked the climax at the midpoint of the entire geopolitical narrative. The Nene, conceived as a shield for the West, was now traveling eastward, a technological time bomb destined to power the very fleets that would soon challenge the fragile post-war peace, a cosmically significant transfer of power that would cost thousands of lives in the unforgiving skies of a distant peninsula. The physical transfer of the 55 engines, 25 of the mighty Nene and 30 of the smaller, equally sophisticated Derwent 5, was a methodical, almost suspenseful crawl that served as the climax at the midpoint of the entire geopolitical narrative, an act of industrial conveyance that irrevocably shifted the balance of power. From the meticulous, oil-scented halls of the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, the crated jewels of British engineering were transported with an almost clinical precision to the port, each wooden container a sealed vault protecting thousands of hours of specialized metallurgical and aerodynamic effort. The British handling was characterized by its meticulous specifications. Every nut and bolt secured, every high-tolerance surface coated in grease and preservative, the precise technical manuals and comprehensive blueprint sets, thousands of pages of specialized knowledge, bound and cataloged as if for a friendly academic exchange. This was the outward veneer of post-war commerce, a facade of trust that masked the strategic significance of the cargo. But as the shipment crossed the Scandinavian Sea and moved into the icy, unforgiving vastness of the Soviet sphere, the atmosphere changed with the climate. The smooth, measured pacing of the British industrial machine gave way to the visceral Soviet impatience and a relentless, all-consuming focus on acquisition. Waiting on the docks of Leningrad was not a friendly trade delegation, but a team of engineers, security officers, and spies, men for whom failure was not a mere professional setback, but an invitation to the Gulag. For them, the cargo was not a purchased good. It was a salvaged prize of war, a windfall of stolen genius to be immediately stripped down and replicated. The juxtaposition was stark. The Western crates, built for safe transit and longevity, were ripped open with a haste bordering on violence. The precise, verbose British instructions were barely consulted, treated as a secondary curiosity compared to the primary, tangible reality of the machine itself. The underlying mathematics of theft was devastating in its simplicity. The Soviet state had not merely acquired a machine, they had purchased the entire painful research and development curve that Britain had taken a decade to climb. This intellectual prize, valued at untold millions of pounds and years of work, was handed over for a mere 300,000 pounds of gold. The Soviet engineers, under the immediate, crushing pressure of Comrade Stalin's personal decree, were not tasked with improving the design, but with brute force duplication. They were operating on a ruthless central mantra. What they build, we can copy, and what they copy, we can build in greater numbers. This was the essence of the Soviet industrial philosophy, to sacrifice the longevity and efficiency prized by the West for sheer, overwhelming quantity over quality production. The engineers, like those working directly under Comrade Klimov, the man tasked with cloning the Nene, did not care about the subtle, specialized nickel content of the British turbine blades. They cared only about finding a locally available alloy that could survive 100 hours of use, enough for the immediate, existential military requirement. The precise, overwhelming data points are used to illustrate the speed of this impending catastrophe. Within weeks of their arrival, the engines were not merely being run on test beds, they were being wholly disassembled. Every component was measured with micrometer precision, X-rayed, and subjected to chemical analysis. The British assumption that the Soviets could never replicate the high-tolerance forgings and specialized centrifugal compressor casting techniques was about to be violently disproven by sheer, concentrated, state-directed effort. The final leg of the transfer took the engines deep into the heart of the Soviet industrial machine, away from the coastal scrutiny of the West to the Kazan aviation plant and the dedicated OKB 117 Design Bureau. This was the industrial crucible, a sprawling, anonymous complex where the British Nene was to be transmuted into the Soviet Klimov VK-1. For the technicians and party officials greeting the crates, this cargo was the answer to the West's technological challenge, the key to building an air force that could face the American B-29 fleet. The sight of the crated engines, now finally on Russian soil, was the moment of complete, unrecoverable strategic loss for Britain. A political gesture born of naiveté had delivered the core technology for an entire generation of Soviet jet fighters and bombers. The Nene had crossed its Rubicon, and in doing so had set the inevitable, terrifying collision course between two industrialized superpowers. The crates had barely been unpacked at the Kazan aviation plant before the clinical process of reverse engineering began, a ruthless, methodical dismemberment of British genius that signaled the true, terrifying intent of the Soviet state. Here, within the sprawling, anonymous confines of the OKB 117 Design Bureau, the imported Nene engine was not revered as a masterpiece. It was treated as a cadaver of superior knowledge, ready for autopsy and immediate replication. The new centerpiece of this industrial effort was designated the Klimov VK-1, a faithful but simplified clone, a machine that would sacrifice the subtle finesse of its British progenitor for the raw, brute force power of mass production. This was the moment where metallurgy met the mathematics of destruction, and the outcome would define aerial warfare for the next decade. The core of the betrayal lay in the turbine blades. The original Rolls-Royce component was a marvel of specialized nickel alloy forging, a meticulously cast, high-tolerance artifact born from years of proprietary research into heat resistance and metal fatigue, designed to endure hundreds of hours of sustained, high-temperature operation. The British engine was, unequivocally, built for longevity and efficiency, a design philosophy of quiet, reliable service. The Soviet response was less elegant, more visceral. Their metallurgical labs, lacking the specialized materials and casting techniques, opted for a crudely machined yet functional steel alloy, heavy with chrome and nickel, which delivered adequate short-term performance but dramatically reduced the engine's service life. The VK1 clone, in its essential philosophy, was built for thrust and expendability, a machine engineered not for the accountant, but for the single, violent combat sortie. The Soviet engine could be quickly built, could deliver the requisite 5,000 pounds of thrust needed for aerial superiority, and could then be unceremoniously discarded and replaced. The speed of the transition was the first clear evidence of the profound failure of British intelligence. The Nene engines arrived in late 1946. By late 1947, less than 12 months later, the VK1 was successfully undergoing its first bench tests. This rapid iteration, this near instantaneous leap across an entire decade of painstaking aerodynamic and metallurgical development, stunned Western observers. The timeline made it brutally clear. The Soviets had bypassed years of research simply by copying the physical solution. The precise data points from the factory were horrifying. The design bureau, under intense political pressure, did not refine. It duplicated. It simplified the casting of the centrifugal compressor to accommodate less precise Soviet machinery, and it used brute force manufacturing to compensate for lower material quality. This highlighted the central, ruthless Soviet advantage: unlimited industrial capacity driven by a singular totalitarian state. In the West, a failed prototype was an expensive setback. In the Soviet Union, it was merely an acceptable loss. The process was fueled by a massive, centrally controlled industrial base, one where labor, often the uncompensated toil of the Gulag system, was treated as an infinitely replenishable commodity. If 100 copies failed, 1,000 more would be built, the state simply pouring steel and human effort into the problem until the requisite performance metric was achieved. There was a profound disregard for human or mechanical waste that Western capitalism could not replicate. The system was optimized for one goal: military parity through overwhelming quantity. The industrial machine roared into high gear. While Comrade Klimov's team finalized the engine's details, the Mikoyan-Gurevich Design Bureau worked in parallel, adapting their nascent airframe to the colossal power now available. The MiG-15, a sleek, swept-wing design based on captured German data, was the vessel, but the VK1 was its furious heart. The engine was perfectly integrated, transforming the aircraft from a promising prototype into a potential global threat. The increase in power was immediately apparent. The raw thrust was enough to give the MiG an unmatched rate of climb and ceiling. The Nene, so carelessly sold, had been cloned, militarized, and mass-produced. The Soviet engine was a symbol of state-directed power, its crude but effective metallurgy a direct consequence of a political will that brooked no failure. The chapter concludes with the initial flight tests of the MiG-15 powered by the VK1, an aircraft now fundamentally capable of challenging any fighter the West possessed, transforming a paper concept into a smoking, tangible reality that would soon bring the conflict to the skies of a distant peninsula. The furious heart of the Klimov VK1 now demanded a commensurate vessel, an airframe that could harness and project the raw, unfiltered power born of British genius and Soviet brute force duplication. That vessel arrived in the form of the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15, a sleek, predatory machine whose very existence was a cruel testament to the success of state-sponsored reverse engineering. When initial reports and grainy photographs of the new Soviet fighter began to filter into Western intelligence offices, the reaction was characterized by a dangerous mixture of complacency and dismissive scorn. The dominant narrative among American and British pilots, still masters of the air in the venerable, propeller-driven P-51 Mustang and the stuttering early jets like the Gloucester Meteor, was one of profound underestimation. They observed the MiG's short, thick fuselage and the large air intake and coined a term dripping with derision: the flying milk bottle. The irony here was a heavy, suffocating weight of history repeating itself. Just a few years prior, the pilots of the German Luftwaffe had mocked the robust, barrel-chested American P-47 Thunderbolt as being too corpulent, too heavy, too complex, only to be shredded by its massive armament and ability to absorb damage. Now the roles were reversed. The West, blinded by its own sense of technological supremacy, laughed at the visual crudity of the Soviet machine, failing utterly to grasp the devastating synergy between its airframe and its cloned engine. The MiG-15 was not an indigenous masterpiece, it was a masterful synthesis of stolen ideas, an airframe built around the colossal energy of the VK-1. Its single most defining feature, the swept wing, was a direct, unapologetic appropriation of captured German aerodynamic data, specifically the work of Dr. Waldemar Voigt and the Messerschmitt P1101 project. This swept wing design was the aerodynamic key that unlocked the VK-1's full potential. By delaying the onset of the devastating compressibility effects near the speed of sound, the MiG-15 was not merely a faster aircraft than the West's straight-winged early jets. It was a potent weapon capable of reaching altitudes and speeds previously reserved only for Western prototypes, creating a vertical arena where no American fighter could effectively challenge it. This was the technical heart of the coming crisis. The engineering was starkly simple, ruthlessly efficient, the short ducting from the nose intake to the powerful centrifugal compressor of the VK-1 maximized thrust. The massive power delivered by the engine combined with the airframe's relatively low weight produced a thrust-to-weight ratio that was, for a short, brutal period, superior to any operational Western fighter. For the Soviet test pilot, a man hardened by the factory floor and the unforgiving calculus of the Soviet flight test program, strapping into the MiG-15 was a profound sensory transformation. It was a leap from the barely adequate power of the Yak-15, a machine that needed to land moments after takeoff to conserve its meager fuel supply, to the unadulterated fury of the VK-1. The rhythmic pacing of the experience was terrifying and exhilarating. The initial slow-burn tension of the cockpit checks, the final slam of the canopy, and then the punchy, action-oriented opening of the takeoff roll. When the throttle was advanced, the engine did not whine or stutter. It roared, transforming the aircraft into a rocket. The sensory description was one of immense, dizzying speed, the pilot feeling as though he was strapping himself to a locomotive that was instantly and violently flung skyward. The MiG-15 could climb with such aggression that it left its pursuers in the vapor trails, reaching 50,000 feet in minutes. This climb rate was the tangible, smoking proof of the fatal indulgence by the British government. The aircraft was not just a fast plane, it was an altitude weapon, capable of intercepting high-flying bombers and dictating the terms of engagement. The technical and the visceral were now inextricably linked. The Klimov VK-1, a clone of the Nene, had turned the Soviet Union from a technological laggard into a fleeting but terrifying peer competitor. The jet that had been dismissed as a flying milk bottle was, in reality, a meticulously assembled package of stolen data and ruthless industrial power, transformed by its engine into a fighter that was, for the first time, technologically equal, perhaps even superior, to anything the West had deployed. This aerodynamic reality would soon be tested in the skies over a distant peninsula, where the price of British naiveté would finally be paid in full. The clock was not measuring mere hours in the summer of 1950. It was measuring the final agonizing seconds before the inevitable collision between two incompatible industrial behemoths. The stage was set across the narrow, muddy expanse of the Yalu River, a serpentine border defining the airspace that would become known, with grim finality, as MiG Alley. This was the inescapable moment where the theoretical betrayal of an engine blueprint in a London office tragically transmuted into visceral, human peril over a forgotten corner of the Asian peninsula. The time for political debate was over. The time for the mathematics of destruction had arrived. The narrative of this impending clash resided in the cockpits of two profoundly different machines and the men who flew them. On one side was Captain Joseph Joe McConnell, or one of his many equally seasoned, equally confident American peers, strapped into the majestic, swept-wing F-86 Sabre. He was the embodiment of Western technological confidence, highly trained, confident in his radar-ranging gun sight, and reassured by the presence of his General Electric J-47 engine, a powerful, robust piece of American engineering derived from the very lineage that birthed the Nene. His pre-flight ritual was a methodical, lengthy checklist, a testament to the complexity and precision of his machine, an exercise underpinned by the implicit, comforting guarantee of unlimited resources. His fuel tanks were full, his ordnance was plentiful, and he flew with the certain knowledge that, should he be shot down, an immense dedicated rescue infrastructure would be mobilized to retrieve him. Across the Yalu, flying out of the secrecy of Manchurian air bases, was the anonymous, factory-hardened Soviet-trained pilot, perhaps a Lieutenant Boris Semyonov, a man whose experience was honed by relentless state training and whose life was secondary to the mission. He flew the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15, a machine whose very existence is the smoking gun of Western naiveté. His machine was powered by the Klimov VK-1, the cloned Nene, a raw, brutal engine that gave him a spectacular rate of climb, but was notoriously short-lived and prone to failure at high speed. The contrast was immediate and absolute. The American flew with the benefit of sophisticated radar guidance and frequent ground communication. The Soviet pilot flew under strict, politically constrained tactical limitations, often instructed to engage and withdraw quickly, forbidden from crossing the Yalu River line, and always under the terrifying pressure of his political officers. The juxtaposition of scales was a rhetorical device that amplified the drama. On the deck of a distant American carrier, a single technician might worry about the correct grade of aviation fuel for one Sabre engine. Concurrently, the Soviet-Chinese supply chain was funneling a staggering volume of resources: fuel, replacement VK-1 engines, ammunition, and pilots, toward the conflict, an industrial torrent that made the individual American effort look almost quaint. The American pilot had plentiful fuel for aggressive maneuvering and long loiters. The early Soviet pilots were often flying under harsh fuel constraints, their missions cut short by the need to conserve precious kerosene, a stark reminder of the logistical pressures faced by the communist supply line. But the central defining tension was the impending confrontation between the two engines. The Nene design now pitted against its own, mass-produced VK-1 clone. The West's technological advantage was about to meet the Soviets' mathematics of production in a deadly test of speed and altitude. The pilots flying the MiG-15 held the advantage of climb and altitude, a clear technical inheritance from the power of their cloned engine. The American pilots held the advantage of training, avionics, and structural integrity. The tension, therefore, was palpable, thick, like the heavy air over the Korean coast. Every sortie flown by the Sabre pilots was an entry into a vertical, brutal arena of the unknown. They knew the MiGs were fast. They did not yet fully grasp the terrifying reality that the enemy's performance was rooted in the very technology they had so carelessly given away. The dramatic buildup was reaching its zenith. Two industrial systems, two ideologies, and two iterations of the same centrifugal jet engine design were about to meet at 50,000 feet in a spectacular, violent thunderclap that would reveal the profound cost of British naivete and usher in the full, terrifying reality of jet-age combat. The moment of collision arrived not with a whisper of distant diplomacy, but with a searing, instantaneous violence high above the Yalu River in the crisp air of late 1950. This was the inescapable test, the high-altitude crucible where the Nene's fatal indulgence was finally paid for in blood and shattered aluminum. For the first time, two opposing fleets of jet fighters, the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet-built MiG-15, engaged in a major air battle, and the comfortable, long-held Western conviction of technological supremacy was shattered with the fury of 1,000 explosions. The American Sabre, a sleek, powerful machine driven by the General Electric J-47 engine, itself an evolutionary descendant of the British jet lineage, represented the culmination of years of methodical, well-funded development. But it was about to meet its terrifying twin, the MiG-15, a machine fueled by the raw, brutal power of the cloned Klimov VK-1. The action was immediate and dramatic. American pilots, veterans of propeller combat, were accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement. Against the MiG, they found themselves violently and fundamentally disoriented. The Soviet fighter, capitalizing on the colossal thrust of the VK-1, could climb with a vertical aggression that the Sabre simply could not match. The combat arena was instantly inverted. The MiG-15 could routinely operate at altitudes where the Sabre became sluggish and disadvantaged, forcing the American pilots into a perpetual defensive posture they had never before experienced. The sheer speed of the engagements defied all prior experience. The jets passed each other at combined velocities exceeding 1,000 miles per hour, generating a sonic signature that American pilots soon dubbed the thunderclap, the violent audible testimony to the cloned engine's power. The technical specifications, once merely dry data points, were suddenly rendered visceral. The VK-1's superior thrust-to-weight ratio, that decisive technical metric, allowed the MiG to dictate the vertical fight, giving the Soviet-trained pilots the ability to drop from the sun, unleash a devastating burst of fire, and then climb immediately back to safety, leaving the Sabre struggling in the thinner air. When the MiG did engage, its firepower was terrifyingly conclusive. Unlike the Sabre's 650 caliber machine guns, the MiG carried a fearsome, heavy combination of two 23mm cannons and a single, devastating 37mm cannon. These were not instruments for surgical precision, they were tools of immediate, wholesale destruction. A single, well-placed burst unleashed an avalanche of steel and lead, capable of ripping an entire wing or tail section from a Sabre in a fraction of a second. The immediate aftermath brought the first horrifying statistical reveal that stunned the American command. Initial loss ratios, compiled from the frantic reports of the first major encounters, revealed a tally far exceeding any expectation against a supposedly inferior foe. The Soviet-trained forces, flying their VK-1-powered MiGs, were achieving an initial kill-to-loss ratio that indicated not only parity, but momentary decisive superiority in the high-altitude vertical fight. This was the moment of profound regret, the dawning, awful realization that the fatal indulgence in London had not merely provided the enemy with a few engines to study, but had instantly given them parity of power, effectively rendering decades of Western jet development obsolete in the high-altitude theater of combat. The somber emotional tone of the narrative prevailed. The cost of that ill-advised sale was now being measured in the loss of skilled pilots and the immediate, staggering financial necessity of a counter-response. The radio silence following the flash of a MiG's burst was often the only evidence. When dialogue did cut through the frantic chaos, it was minimal, sharp, and laden with surprise and terror. One reported authentic transmission from a stunned Sabre pilot moments before his probable destruction articulated the existential shock. "They're just gone, transformed into burning debris. They climb like nothing I've ever seen. Where did they get those engines?" The rhetorical question, hanging unanswered in the cold, thin air of MiG Alley, was the final, brutal assessment of the British decision. The Nene had been cloned, mass-produced, and militarized, and it was now an instrument of war, dictating the terms of the Cold War's first great technological clash. The firestorm had begun, and its ignition point was a seemingly innocuous business transaction years before. The immediate devastating performance of the MiG-15 in the skies above the Yalu River forced the narrative to pivot sharply, moving away from the isolated drama of human peril and back to the cold, unforgiving calculus of the industrial machine. The West, particularly the United States, was stunned, and its response was predictable: a colossal, frantic mobilization of its own, formidable industrial capacity. Factories in California and Ohio immediately ramped up production of the F-86 Sabre and its robust General Electric J-47 engine, confident that the sheer weight of American manufacturing would quickly bury the communist threat. Yet this expectation was built on a flawed premise, a dangerous underestimation of the Soviet Union's centralized, ruthless approach to mass production. The true story of MiG Alley was not one of aerodynamic finesse. It was the story of the unstoppable avalanche, the inevitable fulfillment of the mathematics of industrial defeat. The fundamental rhetorical argument was now laid bare. The American advantage was not, ultimately, in the subtle design of the airfoil or the complexity of the radar gun sight. It was in the scale of mass production. But the Soviet state, by centrally commanding unlimited resources and operating with a complete disregard for human or mechanical waste, proved that it too could wage war by volume. The MiG-15, powered by the cloned VK-1 engine, became the physical embodiment of this Soviet industrial philosophy. Even granting the Sabre a slight edge in refined high-speed handling and the superior training of its pilots, the reality on the ground was far more stark. The Soviet-aligned forces could simply field 5 aircraft for every 4 the West could produce. Quantity, the Soviet strategists understood, possessed a quality all its own. The focus shifted to the factories of Kazan and Kuibyshev, where the VK-1 engine was being churned out with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. The rate of production was astounding. Where Rolls-Royce prioritized engine life and meticulous quality control, the Soviet factories, unconstrained by the economics of the free market, prioritized sheer throughput. They perfected the process of simplifying metallurgy and construction, utilizing less sophisticated, more available alloys, and willingly accepting a shorter engine lifespan, often just 100 hours of operation, in exchange for maximizing output. Reports trickling back to Western intelligence spoke of hundreds of VK-1 engines rolling off the assembly lines every single month, an industrial pace that instantly neutralized the West's technological lead. The constant repetition of phrases like industrial capacity and unlimited resources underscored the core of the problem. The West had voluntarily provided the essential template, and the Soviet system was now replicating it on an overwhelming scale. This was the terrifying reality of the mathematics of defeat. The realization that technological superiority was fleeting, but the Soviet state's ability to centrally command resources and rapidly militarize a design was the more enduring, more profound form of technical supremacy. The cold, overwhelming data points illustrate this scale with devastating finality. Over the course of 5 years of the Korean conflict and its immediate aftermath, the Soviet Union and its satellite nations collectively produced an estimated 15,000 operational MiG-15 aircraft, a number that utterly dwarfed the combined total of the EHI, F-86, Sabre, and every other contemporary British and American jet fighter. Furthermore, the number of VK-1 engines built, including variants for the Ilyushin Il-28 bomber, easily exceeded 30,000 units, a torrent of firepower that far outstripped the combined production of the British Nene and its American derivatives by a factor of several hundred%. The conclusion was inescapable. The ultimate strategic weapon was not a single ingenious machine, but the industrial ecosystem capable of sustaining a conflict through overwhelming quantity. The gift of the Nene had provided the spark, but the relentless Soviet industrial capacity provided the full consuming firestorm. The MiG-15 was a testament not to singular genius, but to the crushing power of the centralized, unfeeling state. A machine that manufactured its own technological parity and then used its unlimited resources to bury its enemies beneath an avalanche of steel and lead. The West might have flown a slightly better aircraft, but the East flew a lot more of them, and in the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare, that was the only number that truly mattered. The last tracer rounds had long since faded over the Yalu River, the roar of the early jet engines replaced by the constant grinding tension of the Cold War. Yet the Klimov VK-1, the brute force clone of the British Nene, remained the true unsung foundation of the entire Soviet technical and industrial supremacy narrative during the pivotal early years. This final accounting concludes the long-form historical documentary not with an explosion, but with the chilling realization of strategic permanence. The engines so carelessly traded for cash in the autumn of 1946 did not merely dictate the terms of a single, localized conflict. They became the enduring technological bedrock upon which an empire built its aerial might for over a decade. The story of the Nene and the VK-1 is, at its core, an unapologetic military business history, a stark lesson in how a single, seemingly trivial political decision can spawn an irreversible shift in the global balance of power. The most profound legacy of the VK-1 was its role as the ultimate enabler of the Soviet sphere of influence. Because the engine was easily replicable, robust, and massively powerful, the Soviet Union could rapidly establish a sphere of influence by arming its allies with effective, modern jet combat power. The MiG-15 and its immediate successor, the MiG-17, both powered by the Nene design, were provided in staggering numbers to China, North Korea, and the entirety of the Warsaw Pact nations. This technical gift, paid for by the British, instantly transformed these satellite states into credible aerial threats, solidifying the communist bloc's military infrastructure and extending the Soviet industrial reach into a truly global enterprise. The subsequent arms race, the immense forced expenditure on the Pratt & Whitney J-57 and its descendants, and the constant fear of global war were all part of a price tag attached to the original engines, a price paid for in blood and fear across multiple continents. The single, apparently benign political decision in 1946, fueled by short-term financial need and long-term political naiveté, resulted in the core engine technology that would power the Soviet military's tactical operations for well over 10 years. From the single-seat fighter to the twin-engine bomber, the centrifugal flow design of the Nene echoed in every corner of the communist air forces. It was the technological spark that ignited the mathematics of production into a full consuming fire, validating the Soviet mantra that industrial capacity was the single, most decisive weapon in modern warfare, trumping ingenuity and even initial design superiority. The central truth of this history is that the conflict was not one of ingenuity against imitation, but one of economic philosophy against ruthless industrial imperative. The Western system, governed by costs and quarterly reports, viewed the jet engine as a high-value commodity to be sold at a profit. The Soviet system, fueled by the central command of unlimited resources and the labor of the Gulag, viewed the engine as a template for brute force duplication and an instrument of ideological supremacy. The final accounting was stark. A handful of gold sovereigns for the original Nene engines had resulted in a decade-long global arms race and the massive, forced re-engineering of the entire American aerospace industry, proving that in the cold calculus of superpower competition, industrial capacity was the only currency that truly mattered, and the betrayal of that capacity was the greatest strategic blunder of the early Cold War. The narrative fades not on a celebration of American technical resurgence, but on the enduring stark image of the machine that forced the change. The MiG-15, a short, thick, anonymous silhouette against a bleak sky, is the enduring symbol of this unapologetic military history. It is a machine that represents a paradox, a Western design made lethal by Soviet execution, a symbol of overwhelming scale and unrelenting political will. It flies on, a ghostly reminder of the cold dawn, perpetually roaring into a long, frigid morning, the sound of its VK-1 engine, the echoing, permanent testament to the irreducible nature of industrial capacity as the ultimate arbiter of global power. The skies of the mid-20th century were forever defined by the engine that Britain gave to Stalin, a single devastating gift that cost the free world a decade of dominance.